You're sitting in a small windowless room. The detective across the table hasn't spoken in almost 2 minutes. He doesn't have to. Silence is doing the work for him. You came here because you thought you could help. Nobody arrested you. Nobody forced you through the door. A detective simply asked if you had a few minutes to answer some questions. You said yes. That was hours ago. There are no windows. The clock disappeared a long time ago. Your phone is gone. You have no idea if it's still morning or already night. The detective finally looks up. Tell me again where you were. You answer exactly as you remember. He nods, writes something down, then asks the same question again. Different words, same answer. Another note, again, again, again. At first, you're patient, then confused, eventually exhausted. The strange thing is that the detective never accuses you, not directly. He simply says something that sounds almost harmless. Earlier, you said something different. Did you? You try to remember. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. For the first time today, you aren't correcting the detective. You're correcting yourself. That's the moment everything changes. Because the most dangerous interrogation doesn't happen across the table, it happens inside your own mind. A few hours from now, you will confess to a crime you never committed, not because you're guilty, not because someone tortured you. You'll confess because your brain begins doing exactly what it evolved to do: survive. Every year, innocent people confess to crimes they never committed. Some lose 10 years of their lives. Others lose 30. Some never live long enough to see their names cleared. The real question isn't why guilty people confess. That's easy. The real question is why innocent people do. And the answer begins hundreds of thousands of years before the first police station was ever built. Your brain didn't evolve inside interrogation rooms. It evolved around campfires. When your ancestors were accused of something, they were never alone. Parents were watching. Friends interrupted. Others remembered what they had seen. The conversation belonged to everyone. Now compare that with the room you're sitting in. One table, one chair, one detective, one version of reality, slowly replacing another. For almost all of human history, this situation simply didn't exist. Your brain never evolved to survive it, and that's exactly why it works. Movies teach you that interrogations are loud. Detectives scream, they slam tables, they threaten until someone breaks. Real interrogations are often much quieter. The detective offers you coffee. He asks if you're comfortable. Sometimes he even smiles, because raising his voice isn't the fastest way to change your mind. Making you doubt yourself is. He isn't watching your answers, he's watching your confidence. The words matter. The hesitation matters more. Most people believe memory works like a video recording. Something happens. Your brain saves it. Later, you press play. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus spent decades proving that's completely wrong. Every time you remember something, your brain doesn't replay it, it rebuilds it. Not perfectly, approximately. Loftus showed volunteers the same event, then changed a single word in a follow-up question, just one word. That tiny change caused people to remember broken glass that never existed. Objects that weren't there, entire moments that never happened. They weren't lying. They genuinely believed those memories were real. Think about how extraordinary that is. If one carefully chosen word inside a university laboratory can quietly rewrite a memory, what do you think 6 hours inside an interrogation room can do? Here's what most people never realize. Your brain wasn't designed to remember perfectly, it was designed to survive. And survival in this room starts to look like agreement. The detective leans forward. We already know you were there. You answer immediately. No. He doesn't argue, doesn't even react. He simply says, "That's interesting." Then looks back down at his notes. And suddenly, for the first time all day, you're no longer wondering what the detective knows. You're wondering whether your own memory is beginning to fail. That single thought is the real beginning of the interrogation, because from this moment on, the detective isn't fighting against your story. He's waiting for you to start fighting against it yourself. Now imagine someone asking you exactly where you were at 7:18 p.m. 3 weeks ago. Not around 7. Not after dinner. Exactly 7:18. What shoes were you wearing? Who was standing next to you? Most people couldn't answer, not because they're hiding anything, because your brain was never designed to remember ordinary moments in perfect detail. It keeps the headlines, it throws away the rest. Now answer those same questions 20 times. The first answer feels easy. By the 10th, you start correcting yourself. Not because you're lying, because remembering isn't like opening a file. It's more like painting the same picture over and over again. Each time, a few tiny details change. The detective notices every one of them. Then he says something that sounds almost reasonable. Earlier you said 6:30. Now it's 6:40. You mentioned a blue jacket. Now it's black. Every correction seems small. until they all point in the same direction. Not toward guilt, toward uncertainty. And this is where something important happens. The detective doesn't need to destroy your memory. He only needs to destroy your confidence in it. Those aren't the same thing. One is almost impossible to change. The other can disappear, one question at a time. Now add exhaustion, hours of sitting still, hours of repeating yourself. Neuroscientist Bruce McEwen found that prolonged stress doesn't just make people anxious, it changes how the brain processes attention, memory, and decision-making. As stress hormones stay elevated for hours, your attention narrows, your working memory weakens. Logical thinking becomes harder. At the beginning of the interview, you're trying to remember. Hours later, you're simply trying to escape. That's a completely different goal. You stop asking, how do I prove I'm innocent? You start asking, how do I make this end? That single shift is more dangerous than anything the detective could say. Here's the terrifying part. Everything you've heard so far happens before anyone confesses. Researcher Saul Kassin found something that overturned one of the biggest myths about criminal investigations. Innocent suspects don't simply deny everything forever. Many confess because they believe it's the fastest way out. They still know they're innocent. They tell themselves, I'll explain everything once I'm home. I'll fix this tomorrow. But tomorrow doesn't always arrive. Then comes the most disturbing discovery of all. Internalized false confessions. Cases where innocent people stop pretending and genuinely begin wondering whether they somehow committed the crime after all. Not because new evidence appeared, because their own words became new evidence against themselves. A confession starts long before anyone says, I did it. The reality of this psychological trap is well documented by organizations like the Innocence Project, which have overturned hundreds of wrongful convictions. And the records show the same names over and over again. One of the most famous examples is Brendan Dassey, 16 years old, quiet, trusting. He didn't walk into that room expecting to confess. He walked in believing he was helping. At first, he said he didn't know. Investigators suggested a detail. He agreed. Another detail. He adjusted his answer. Hour after hour, the interview stopped being a search for memory. It became a search for agreement. Millions of people later watched those recordings and asked, how could anyone confess to something they didn't do? But that's the wrong question. The right question is this: what would have happened if you had been sitting in that chair instead? Because Brendan wasn't unusual, he was simply human. Years before Brendan, 5 teenagers entered separate interrogation rooms after a brutal attack in Central Park. Questioned for hours, isolated, exhausted, every one of them confessed. Their stories didn't even match. Some contradicted each other. Some contradicted the physical evidence. Years later, DNA identified the real attacker. But here is what made those cases so devastating. Once a confession exists, people unconsciously reorganize every other piece of evidence around it. A weak witness suddenly feels convincing. An uncertain timeline suddenly feels clear. Confessions don't just change investigations, they change the way everyone interprets reality, including the person who confessed. Imagine hearing your own recorded voice calmly describing a crime you never committed. Even knowing you were exhausted, pressured, desperate to leave, part of your brain starts asking a terrifying question. If I didn't do it, why did I say I did? At the beginning of this video, you were sitting in that room convinced that innocence was enough. Now you know something far more unsettling. Elizabeth Loftus showed that memory is surprisingly fragile. Bruce McEwen showed that stress shapes the brain. And Saul Kassin showed that false confessions aren't rare accidents. They're predictable outcomes under the right pressure. None of them were trying to excuse criminals. They were trying to understand something more important: how ordinary human minds behave under extraordinary conditions. Because that's the uncomfortable truth hidden inside every false confession. It doesn't reveal how strange a few people are. It reveals how ordinary all of us are. You don't need to be weak. You don't need to be unintelligent. You don't need to be guilty. You only need to be human. Truth and certainty are not the same thing. Most of us spend our entire lives believing they are. The interrogation room is one of the few places that proves otherwise. You came into this room believing the detective was your biggest problem. He never was. The moment you stopped trusting your own memory, you became the most convincing witness against yourself. And that is when the confession truly begins.